Hello and welcome to the F Word and Friends, where we talk everything finance. And this episode we have very special guests. We've got two advocates, Advocate Hewitt and Advocate Robenheimer, and we've got Pierre Jabota, one of the directors at Bovest Wealth Management. Today we are talking Ponzi schemes and especially crypto Ponzi schemes. And we thought, who else to get but two of the top guys that I probably know that'll be able to just help us and just shed some light on Ponzi schemes, especially crypto Ponzi schemes, and tell us basically what the dangers are and what happens when a scheme basically fails. So let's start off with the first one. What is a Ponzi scheme and sort of what are the characteristics of a Ponzi scheme?
Well, let me start off. I don't know whether there's a formal classification or definition of a Ponzi scheme, but I think generally a Ponzi scheme is a scheme which is fraudulent, where the perpetrators of the scheme utilize investments by later investors in order to pay withdrawals by existing or old investors. I think it is characterized to a large extent by promises of high and constant interest or profits, which is what attracts people to a Ponzi scheme and which is what keeps the investments coming. And obviously it is characterized by the fact that at some stage it fails because it's simply unsustainable. A Ponzi scheme is by its very nature unsustainable. So I would say that on a high level, that is the characteristics of a Ponzi scheme.
So you spoke about high interest, but what do you think is high interest rates? Because, you get people that say, no, we can offer you 30% or we can offer you 6%. In your opinion, what do you think is a sustainable interest rate for someone to deliver?
Well, you guys would know better than I, but I think a high interest rate is if you are significantly above the repo rate. I think that would be high interest rates, and I accept that any investments, especially a high risk investment, would be able to yield those types of proceeds or interest. But not on a constant basis. I think you guys would agree. Is the high risk investment would yield those interest rates or proceeds at some stage, but not constantly. And that's why one of the characteristics of a Ponzi scheme is the fact that it promises and produces those high interest rates on a constant basis.
Yeah, I just want to get into that because you can see like in the US, the interest rates in their repo rate is lower than in South Africa. Yes. What means is South Africa is a higher risk already. And then you see some banks will give you an 8% or 9% interest rate, but some banks will give you a 10 or 11%. But that is also a higher risk.
Yes.
But people don't realize it because they think if they get the interest rate, they don't understand the underlying asset can fail. I think most people feel, oh, if I get my interest monthly, that's a safe investment. But you don't know the whole asset can actually fall away. We said what's the definition of a Ponzi scheme, but what actually happens when a Ponzi scheme fails?
Well, I think perhaps just to put the listeners on a solid base, there's one or two concepts that need to be borne in mind, because Ponzi schemes inevitably fail and gets dealt with on an insolvent basis. Not every single Ponzi scheme I accept, but generally speaking, they get dealt with within the insolvency law realms. So if we're talking insolvency, listeners must understand that there's a difference in definition between insolvency, i.e. from an accounting perspective per se, and what the law recognizes as insolvency. And we also need to distinguish between natural persons like you and me and Francois, and natural persons who use juristic entities like companies to start a scheme or a Ponzi or a pyramid from. So the first important thing is the generally accepted definition for insolvency when a company is used is commercial insolvency. In other words, can that company pay its debts as and when they fall due? That's the general definition in law for insolvency. With a natural person, if I'm running the Ponzi scheme in my own name, in other words, as a sole proprietor, the question would be, do my assets fairly valued exceed my liabilities? And that's the legal test. And again, I use the word generally and will probably use it quite often because, as with anything, there's exceptions. So let's take a company, for example, the easiest example. I start a company and I've got no underlying good, I've got no underlying service. I have a contract, I produce marketing material to lure in unsuspecting investors. And I say, well, if you put 100 Rand in with me, I will give you 10 Rand back every single month. And very frequently in these types of schemes, there's guarantees of returns. Now, you guys know, being in the investment world, that it's unless the underlying insurance product has a guarantee in backed by the insurer, it's impossible to guarantee returns to your clients.
But that guarantee is normally very low.
Yes, it's a very low guarantee. But at some stage, like Renier said in the introduction, the outflows, in other words, the promises of outflows, becomes more than the inflows into the scheme, because there's only a couple of billion people on Earth, and somewhere the Bernie Madoffs in that Ponzi scheme, you are going to run out of investors. And so you are going to owe more as a company, if we're talking from the company's perspective. You are going to owe more to investors than the amount of money that comes in. And that's usually where the scheme collapses, because you are unable to generate those promised returns to the investors. What would then, again, generally speaking, happen is some investor would say, well, I'm not happy with this under our contract, and I purposefully put it in inverted commas because no doubt we'll discuss it in due course. You owe me the money, and so a liquidation application very frequently gets instituted, which then places the company under liquidation, and then the mechanisms of the insolvency law kicks in.
So there's always this thing that people say, at least be first out or be early out. Take your money and run. Is that true? Like, I invested, I got my 50%, 100% back. Woohoo! Loving life. But is there any recourse from the law side that I need to pay money back on gains or anything like that?
No, it's not true as a general rule that get out early and you're safe. As I said a moment ago, what happens as soon as the company is liquidated is the mechanisms of the insolvency law kicks in. What I mean by that is the old Companies Act, the 1973 Companies Act, read with the Insolvency Act, creates a statutory mechanism. And the policy behind it, behind insolvency law, to use the phrase broadly, is that independent liquidators get appointed by the master, and their purpose at that stage is, in legal terms, they use the word concursus creditorum, is that all debtors and creditors of that estate, their rights and obligations at liquidation gets frozen and gets crystallized, and the liquidators must treat everyone equally, subject to certain preferences and rankings of creditors within the insolvency law. And so the policy behind insolvency law really is to protect all creditors. The liquidators get appointed to bring in the assets of the company, go and find them wherever they may be. And Renier could perhaps in a second just explain what type of mechanisms there are in our law for the liquidators to go and gather assets. But they must gather all the assets, they must treat all the creditors the same, and then eventually liquidate the money and the assets they've been able to obtain of the company, and then pay that out to creditors. And like I said, creditors in terms of the insolvency law gets ranked. For example, a secured creditor like a bank who has a mortgage bond over a property owned by the company. Theoretically, they would stand first in the queue for that money in relation to that property when it gets sold. But as in Afrikaans, Jan Publiek, we all get treated the same, and we get cent in the rand as a dividend at the end of the day. So no, there are mechanisms, whether you first in, last out, for the liquidators to go and retrieve property from you that belongs to the company in terms of the definitions in the Insolvency Act.
Yeah. Before we go into the mechanisms, so do I understand this correctly? I've put in 100 Rand, I've made 100 Rand.
A few years ago, yeah.
A few years ago. now the liquidators come back to me and say, well, no, you need to pay back the 100 Rand, or even, will that be even more? So will I lose my initial investment as well?
So I can answer that question by discussing the mechanisms, and as you will see through the discussion, it does depend on when you make your withdrawal. Okay. But I just want to add to what Mr. Hewitt said as far as the purpose of the Insolvency Act, because I think for many people, young public, it may seem to be unfair, the consequences of the Insolvency Act sometimes. But we must keep in mind, and I will illustrate, well, I'll attempt to illustrate it by using a Ponzi scheme as an example. The purpose of the Insolvency Act is to ensure that everyone is treated fairly and equally, depending on where they rank as a creditor. Normally, let's use a Ponzi scheme as an example. Normally, there wouldn't be secured creditors. Those are banks. Normally, it's the creditors are almost all of them are concurrent creditors. Now, you can imagine, because of the way in which a Ponzi scheme is run, you would have a handful of individuals that won from the scheme and a lot of people that actually lost. Yeah. The purpose, the entire purpose and the way in which it is implemented is to ensure that the people that won, let's call it winners, from this Ponzi scheme must return those winnings. Whether they were aware of the fact that it's a Ponzi scheme or not, I think we all accept that most people that are involved in a Ponzi scheme, whether as a loser or a winner, were unaware of the fact that it's a fraudulent scheme. So the intention or the purpose is to ensure that everyone is treated fairly, and for that purpose, a winner is obliged to return at least the winnings.
Okay.
Well, and the other consideration as far as a Ponzi scheme is concerned in general law is that a person shouldn't profit from an unlawful scheme. So apart from the fact that the insolvency law requires everyone to be treated fairly in general, a person shouldn't profit from an unlawful scheme. So that the mechanisms of the Companies Act, which is applicable mostly with Ponzi schemes because they are mostly done through a company, and the Insolvency Act, you will find mostly, and those are not the only ones, but mostly relevant to a Ponzi scheme is sections 26 and 29 of the Insolvency Act. Firstly, section 29 provides for the return of an undue preference. So where a disposition made by a company is an undue preference, it must be returned. It's set aside, and that preference must be returned. As far as that section is concerned, it is not yet considered whether or not you made an investment. So 6 months before the company is put into liquidation, if specifically a Ponzi scheme pays out to you, the likely result would be that those funds will be returned without considering the investment that you made. That's not the only requirements of Section 29. Section 29 requires that at the time the disposition is made, the company must be insolvent, or the individual must be insolvent. I think we'll discuss at a later stage the solvency possibilities of a Ponzi scheme, but let's accept for a moment that a Ponzi scheme is insolvent, so that requirement is met. The court will always have a discretion as far as Section 29 is concerned to declare that payment did not serve to unduly prefer one creditor over another. But I think generally we can accept, if it is a Ponzi scheme and it's proven to be a Ponzi scheme, we can accept that company or that individual was at all times insolvent, and that any dispositions made by that company 6 months before the date of liquidation will in all probability be set aside as an undue preference. Applying this to a Ponzi scheme, your example of investing 100 Rand and having received 100 Rand in return, if we assume that those dispositions were made more than 6 months before the company was liquidated, if you make an investment in an unlawful scheme of 100 Rand, our Supreme Court of Appeal has said because the company, it's a fraudulent scheme and the company has fraudulent purposes, that investment that you make is a void transaction. You can't, which means when you make that investment, you have, at the moment, whether you're aware of it or not, the moment you make that 100 Rand investment, you have a claim against the company for that 100 Rand back because of the unlawfulness of the company and therefore the unlawfulness of the contract that you concluded.
Yeah.
The effect of that claim that you have against the company the moment you make that investment means that the repayments that you get from the scheme is not dispositions without value up until your claim effectively has been repaid. In other words, the effect of it is if you make an investment of 100 Rand, the first 100 Rand that you receive from the company wouldn't be dispositions without value and therefore couldn't be set aside under Section 26 of the Insolvency Act. I don't know whether you want to add something to that.
Yeah, just to take it a step further. If you invested 200 Rand, but you only got 100 Rand back, then the 100 Rand win, profit, that's the portion that would be set aside and that would have to be returned under Section 26.
But it feels so unfair because, you're just an investor. Now, most people, if you're a little bit ignorant or whatever it may be, you invest your hard-earned money and you just want something back. So it feels as if sort of you're the criminal in this whole thing. You haven't done anything wrong. You've just invested. Now, most people probably use those gains at some stage to say, okay, well, I've got 100 Rand, bought myself a house, not with 100 Rand, but you know what I mean. So what happens in that case where somebody's used that money or they've treated themselves to holiday and they don't have that money anymore? What will happen in a case like that?
Well, they're not going to have a holiday for quite some time. No, in all seriousness, I think people need to accept the law is not perfect.
Yeah.
It's not perfect. It can't cater for everything and anything. What it attempts to do is to strike a balance of fairness. And a practical example. In a Ponzi scheme, you spoke about the investors who were in early and the investors who were in late. You invested early. You invested 100 Rand. And over a 5-year course, however long it took for the scheme to collapse, from your 500 Rand investment, you got 50 million Rand back. I invest late in the scheme and I put 5 million Rand in and I don't get a single cent back. You can see the discrepancy in the fairness concept.
Yeah.
And so the law, albeit not perfect, attempts to provide a mechanism to treat everyone equally. Yes, it may be that the person who invested 500 Rand had the spoils in terms of lifestyle of the 5 million, but he or she, unfortunately, is going to go through some strife for a while to try and pay back that money. Whereas the other person is going to get 20 cents in the Rand or 10 cents in the Rand. And of course you have, even if it's an unlawful Ponzi scheme, you have SARS. You have SARS who usually at some point puts in a massive claim. And they have some form of statutory preference. They're not first in the queue, but they have some form of statutory preference in terms of income. Because albeit that the scheme is unlawful, that scheme, if we take a company, and you take the definitions of the Income Tax Act, gross income, a trade, they receive, under the concept of receive, they receive that money. And so they're gonna seek to get income tax.
Jeez.
But we want to know what happens to the guy who started all of this, because he's actually the criminal who started this and benefited probably the most. What normally happens in the case?
Yeah, so what should happen? I mean, if someone conducts or starts or perpetuates a fraudulent scheme knowingly, I mean that is criminal conduct, and that person should be charged criminally. Civilly, I don't think a liquidator would have much difficulty in holding that person should be liable for the debts of the company. In other words, liable to pay whatever debts remain of that company. And as you said, this is a person that's already run a fraudulent scheme. What would remain? I mean, that's a question that's answered on a case-by-case basis. But you can assume that such a person might have made a plan. But I mean, that's not something that we can foresee. The fact of the matter is that in all likelihood, because of his conduct, because of perpetuating the fraudulent nature of this business, he would probably be a director of this company. He would not have complied with the requirements or the duties that one would expect of a director. So I couldn't foresee much difficulty in holding. It's not automatic, but I couldn't foresee that a liquidator would have difficulty in holding that person would be personally liable for the debts of the company.
Because he probably received the salary as well and remuneration.
He would have been winner number one. He would have. I mean, if knowingly running a Ponzi scheme, you do that for a reason. So he would probably be the biggest winner anyway. That it does seem unfair, and I agree 100% with what Mr. Hewitt said. Is you must always keep in mind, if you are the person that's to repay, if you're a winner, the intention of and I say again, the intention or the purpose of reclaiming those proceeds is in order that it can be distributed amongst the creditors of the company, which in a Ponzi scheme would be unsuspecting investors that came in last, that just lost. So that is, I think it's the intention is to get a fair result. Depending on where you stand, it might seem unfair, but the fact that someone is unaware, and I think we can all accept that people involved in a Ponzi scheme, at least initially, is unaware of the fact, or ignorant of the fact that it's a fraudulent scheme. That is unfortunately, or fortunately for the losers, not a requirement. It's not necessary for a liquidator to prove that this person was willingly involved in a fraudulent scheme. In fact, I think we can all accept that normally they were unaware of the fact of the fraudulent nature of it.
Yeah, yeah. So Douglas, you briefly spoke about a Ponzi scheme never being solvent or always insolvent. So for Joe Soap, like myself, what does that mean?
Well, because a Ponzi scheme, and we're not talking about Bitcoin, because a Ponzi scheme is an invalid scheme. From day one, there's no underlying lawful business. There's very, very frequently no lawful generation of income in a business. If you take a business selling furniture, 100 Rand comes in, that 100 Rand through the manufacturing process and selling of tables gets generated to 200, and so we grow the business. In a Ponzi scheme, that's not the case. Because from day one, those contracts are invalid. In other words, the investor who pays into the Ponzi scheme 100 Rand immediately has a claim back from the company, the scheme. Okay. The scheme can never be solvent because it can never generate, and it never does, more income than it has expenses. It always has more expenses. The collapse, you need to distinguish in your mind between the solvency question and the collapse question. Because from day one, as a general rule, I haven't seen in our law reports any Ponzi scheme, excluding Bitcoin, that's been solvent for a while. From day one, if there's no underlying cash generation, it's insolvent. The collapse only happens later because if you invest today and I give you money back today, you have no issues. Same with me, same with PJ, same with Renier. But at some point you run out of investors. Yeah. All of us still want our returns back. There's eventually hundreds, thousands of us in big schemes that want our returns back. But there's only 10 or 20 joining. And so that triggers the collapse. But that doesn't mean the scheme was solvent up to that point. The scheme was insolvent from day one because it just never had more assets or income than expenditure.
So then you go back to that 6 months thing. Then you go from the beginning. You can take money back from the beginning.
See, that's the thing with Section 26 and 29, which are the main mechanisms that a liquidator uses to recover funds that were paid out by a Ponzi scheme. It is a requirement for both those sections that the company at the time the disposition was made was insolvent. Section 26 has certain assumptions as far as that's concerned, but it is a requirement that the company at the time the disposition made is insolvent, and that is because it's the Insolvency Act that makes that requirement. That is assets and liabilities. It's not the ability to pay debts. It's assets and liabilities. And the Supreme Court of Appeal said, as far as a fraudulent scheme is concerned, which a Ponzi scheme always is, that I think, and as far as dealing with the Creon scheme, the Supreme Court of Appeal, if memory serves me correctly, said the insolvency of the company is dictated by the unlawfulness of its business. In other words, a company that since commencement is unlawful in its purpose, unlawful in its agreements, can never be solvent.
So from basically all the money
from day one. So it means that the company is always insolvent. As Douglas said, that contract, that fraudulent first agreement is that can't translate into an asset for the company, because when that first investment is made, the company immediately has a duty to repay that investment, whether the investor is aware of it or not. There's always such a company can never be solvent.
But I think to summarize, be careful in what you invest. You think you get good returns, but from the beginning, even if you get it, you probably will have to pay it back.
Yeah.
You asked a question in the beginning. I just want to add on to what you say now. You asked a question in the beginning about interest. What is too high interest rate or too high a yield? And again, you guys are the experts in this. But I think from a point of logic, if you are an unsuspecting investor out there and you see or hear about a good opportunity, first talk to these guys. But after, if you don't have access to that, just think about it in this way. The biggest bank in South Africa, I think, is Standard Bank in terms of asset base. If a bank, in other words, the entity with the biggest amount of assets, the strongest financially, in theory, can't give you that return, a 30% return. Logically, how is it possible that some random company is able to guarantee you these large profits over and above what, for example, a bank can give you or a well-accepted investment vehicle can give you? And I think that usually is a good red flag to start at. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying from a perspective of logic, that's a good starting point.
Yeah, and again, I mean, the biggest thing that people like are high guaranteed returns. Yeah. So anyone can get high returns, just not guaranteed on a consistent monthly basis. And we accept that. We accept you will have high returns, low returns, but people like the high guaranteed return.
But you guys can say, is that something that's real? Is there really such a thing as high guaranteed consistent returns? I mean, you can solve the world's problems with that.
Yeah, exactly. But again, I think everything runs around greed. People love the high returns with zero risk. Everyone's aggressive, conservative investors out there. They want the highest possible return with the lowest amount of risk. But you touched on something. You touched on Bitcoin a little bit earlier. And we see and we hear of a lot of crypto pyramid schemes that fail. And I heard the other day that crypto is being seen as an asset and not like a monetary value. So with my example of 100 Rand, I put in 100 Rand. It was a Zuid-Afrikaanse buffel that I put in there. But why is this true that crypto is seen as an asset, and why is there a distinction between the two?
Yeah, so crypto is not a currency in South Africa or anywhere else, as far as I'm aware. It is an asset.
But isn't it in the name, cryptocurrency?
Sure, but it's also referred to as crypto assets. So it's also in the name.
Just because you say something is an investment doesn't make it a Ponzi scheme. Not make it a Ponzi scheme.
But I think, I don't think crypto obviously doesn't meet the requirements of a fiat currency. Fiat currency having to be somehow underwritten by a sovereign country. I'm not sure what those requirements are, but it doesn't meet it. It is also not, as far as I'm aware, legal tender in in South Africa or in Europe, and I think in America even, legal tender. Obviously, any person can accept cryptocurrency in exchange for something else, but that would be probably more bartering than actual using it as currency. But I think worldwide at this stage, cryptocurrency and crypto assets are accepted to be an asset. It's an incorporeal, intangible asset, but as far as I'm aware, also the SARS accepts it as an asset. In other words, if there's an increase in your asset value, you might be liable for capital gains tax or income tax.
So interesting for that, SARS don't see it as capital gains, where on shares they will say if you hold it for 5 years or longer, we will tax you for capital gains. They say all of crypto assets is speculative. Okay. So they will, even if you have a gain longer than 5 years, they will say income tax.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I don't think we haven't settled on anything in the world, I think, as far as cryptocurrency is concerned. But at this stage, it is an asset, and I can't see it being anything else. It is an asset. It is new. I think we can use examples now as far as the Insolvency Act is concerned, where it doesn't seem to be properly catered for. I don't think the authors and the legislatures, when the 1973 Companies Act was written, and especially the 1936 Insolvency Act was written and authored, considered the possibility of such a thing. But I mean, I think it does meet the requirements of an asset. It is incorporeal, yes, it is intangible, but nonetheless, I mean, so is a share in a company or many other examples. But I don't. I think the short answer is it doesn't meet the requirements for it to be considered to be a currency.
Okay, so what will that mean then with a Ponzi scheme? Will that mean that the gains would be in crypto and they would have to repay the estate in crypto, or how will that work then? Because I mean, if you look at Bitcoin, it's gone up from 300,000 Rand 1 or 2 years ago or 3 years ago.
Yes.
It's close to 2 million Rand now. So now I have to buy a coin of 2 million Rand and give it back.
Yeah. Well, I think that is a difficulty that may become very relevant because of these crypto schemes or crypto Ponzi's. Let's use an example, and I think it does matter. You have a lot of there are some schemes where you actually make your contribution or your investment in rand and cent, and then the scheme purports to invest in cryptos and some type of derivatives as far as cryptos are concerned, and then you make your withdrawal also in rand and cent. Then it doesn't really matter. The involvement of crypto in that scenario is actually irrelevant. And if it's a Ponzi scheme, the likelihood of there actually being trade, as they say, is unlikely as well. I think what you are referring to is where you make your investment, perhaps more relevantly, your withdrawal, in the form of cryptocurrency. Let's use Bitcoin as a good example. You made your investment in the form of a Bitcoin, and you make your withdrawal in the form of a Bitcoin.
Yes.
Now, as we discussed earlier, at some stage the liquidator might say, you withdrew a Bitcoin, and the company was at all times insolvent. It's a fraudulent company. Those transactions are illegal. I asked the court to set aside that disposition. I want my Bitcoin back. If you didn't liquidate your Bitcoin 5 years ago, and you still have it, there's no problem.
Yep.
You give back the Bitcoin. If you liquidated your Bitcoin at a time, let's say that Bitcoin was 200,000 Rand, which is only a few years ago, then you have to pay back 1.8 million Rand today, because what Section 32 of the Insolvency Act says It says that if a disposition is set aside in terms of inter alia 26 or 29, which we've already discussed, and it is the disposition of an asset that is set aside. An asset, as we know, which probably includes cryptocurrency, and you can't return the asset. Then you must return the value of the asset at the time the disposition was, and the value is determined at the time the disposition is made, or at the time that it is set aside, whichever is the higher. And that may result in what seems to be some unfair consequences. Just as an example, this is your example. You in 2020 or 2021, when everyone seemed to be investing in some type of cryptocurrency, or there was a lot of investment in cryptocurrency, and unfortunately there were some crypto schemes. You received you invested, let's say, 1 Bitcoin, and you withdrew 2 Bitcoins.
Yeah.
At a time that the Bitcoin was valued at 200,000 Rand. Conceivably, the liquidators can ask you to return 1 Bitcoin. You immediately liquidated the Bitcoin when you received it, because you only purchased Bitcoin, and you only accepted Bitcoin because that's the way in which the scheme makes the withdrawals. They didn't give you the option of receiving it in fiat currency and cent. So you received the Bitcoin, you immediately liquidated it, and you used the 200,000 Rand. 5 years later, 6 years later, the liquidator might say, well, I want my Bitcoin back. And if you can't give my Bitcoin back, I want the value of the Bitcoin. On the day on which the disposition was made, let's say that was 200,000 Rand, or the day on which the disposition is set aside, today, I think it's about 1.8 million Rand, the value of a Bitcoin, which does seem to be very unfair.
That raises the stakes a lot more
Yes.
than a normal.
So if you go for a Ponzi scheme, then go for a crypto Ponzi scheme.
Yeah.
That's perhaps a good segue into a question or a statement you had earlier where you said, well, we'll discuss the insolvency issue that solvency or insolvency issue that may arise in Bitcoin. And I was quite careful to point out that from day one, fraudulent schemes which deals with cash, or put differently, which doesn't deal with cryptocurrencies, is insolvent from day one. The interesting thing with Bitcoin, because of the price fluctuations, is I'm not aware, there may be a case, I'm not aware of a case where it actually worked out like this, but conceivably, a Ponzi scheme dealing with Bitcoin may be insolvent on day 1, 2, and 3, but on day 300 may in actual fact be solvent again. And I'll briefly explain the consequences of that. If the price of Bitcoin was 200,000 Rand 2 years ago, and there's 100 or there's 10 Bitcoin, let me just reduce it, my maths, I studied law. So if there's 10 Bitcoin at 200,000 Rand, that's 2 million Rand, if we just translate it to currency, worth of asset within the pool of the company. If that exact same 10 Bitcoin, so there's been Bitcoin paid out coming in, but let's assume it's 10 still, and that's now increased to 2 million Rand, then suddenly we sit with 20 million Rand. And so it may be from time to time that scheme actually becomes solvent because of the increase in value. It's very infrequently as simple as that, but that's just a simple example to explain to you. Now, the effect of that would be, let's assume a scenario like that plays out. In order for sections 26 and 29, and I won't bore you with the detail, but when it's a company, you have to read that with section 340 sub 2, I think, of the Old Companies Act, which then applies those sections. Which says that when dispositions in the insolvency sense, in the Insolvency Act, comes up under companies, then you apply those sections. But the key thing is, for those sections to operate, the scheme must be insolvent. The company must be insolvent. Otherwise, those schemes don't operate. Yeah. Because under the Old Companies Act, the section which deals with the liquidation of companies, a prerequisite is that it must be insolvent for many of those sections, including these sections, to actually operate.
Yeah.
And so that's quite a conundrum. Because if last night, when a court gave a judgment against you and set aside a disposition because the company was insolvent, and this is a stupid example, but it illustrates the point, the company was insolvent, then a disposition would be set aside and you'd have to pay back either the asset or the value, depending on if you have it. But if overnight in America, while we were sleeping, the Bitcoin Federal Exchange was created, and Bitcoin suddenly skyrocketed, and the company became solvent overnight, and in another case tomorrow, an expert testifies in court and says, well, crypto is now worth 10 million. And so that pool of Bitcoin that we have in this company, this means this company is flourishing again. The disposition may not tomorrow be set aside against someone else because the company is no longer insolvent. And so you see what difficulties it can create. And I think that the general consensus is that a lot must still play out in our law through the courts when it comes to crypto assets in general, the insolvency law applied to crypto assets, crypto Ponzi schemes, etc. There's no fixed basis and a body of law which has told us and cemented, what the position is in relation to a load of things.
Thank you so much, the both of you, for coming in. We really appreciate the knowledge that you shared. If you are running a crypto Ponzi scheme or a Ponzi scheme, I hope you don't cross hairs with these two. They obviously know what they're doing. And thank you so much for watching. Please leave a comment and please remember to like and subscribe to our channel.